Welcome to Context. I'm Brad Harris. Today, we're exploring a form of conflict that rarely gets recognized for what it is, but may be more consequential than armies and missiles. I'm talking about narrative warfare, the battle over national self-image, cultural legitimacy, and historical memory. Unlike propaganda, which aims to manipulate, what I call narrative warfare operates more subtly. It shapes how a nation's citizens see themselves, and by extension, how the world sees them. Thank you to my supporters on Patreon. If you haven't joined me on Patreon yet, but you'd like to help sustain this work and access supporter-only episodes, including the one I released last week on the psychological and philosophical history of humanoid robots, you can sign up right now at patreon.com/Brad Cole Harris. Last count, 11 out of 44 Context episodes are supporter-only, so a full quarter of my content. Again, that's at patreon.com/Brad Cole Harris. The link is in the show notes. Okay. We often assume that geopolitics is governed by material realities, military strength, natural resources, technological advantage. But beneath those levers of power is something softer, but no less important. The stories nations tell themselves about who they are, what they stand for, where they're going. These stories may be myths, they may be partial, but they are rarely powerless. They shape not only how people vote, but whether they believe their country is worth defending at all. In this episode, we'll explore how competing national narratives have defined the fate of empires. We'll explain the role of historical storytelling in America's current identity crisis, and we'll ask a newly urgent question. What happens to a superpower when it stops believing in its own story? Let's begin with the obvious. Every civilization has its origin myth. Rome had the she-wolf. Britain had Arthur. China had the Mandate of Heaven. These weren't just bedtime stories, they were frameworks for legitimacy, psychological glue for holding large, complex societies together. And crucially, they were rarely self-effacing. Consider the United States. From its inception, the American story has been one of exceptionalism, of a new world forged in liberty, guided by providence, destined to offer hope to the oppressed. Thomas Jefferson's preamble to the Declaration of Independence, proclaiming that all men are created equal, wasn't meant to be a factual statement. It was designed as a foundational ethos, a political poem aimed at reshaping the moral architecture of the modern West. Lincoln's Gettysburg Address further mythologized the Republic as a nation conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. His words were instruments of cohesion in the midst of conflict, rallying Americans to believe in a shared purpose greater than themselves. France, too, has long drawn from the myth of Republican virtue. The storming of the Bastille became a national parable of liberty triumphing over tyranny, despite the chaotic, often contradictory nature of the French Revolution. Similarly, Russia has looked to its imperial inheritance with narratives of divine destiny, from the czars of the First Rome and Constantinople to the Soviet dream of proletarian justice. Since the fall of the Soviet Union, the modern Russian state has attempted to forge a post-communist identity by reactivating imperial nostalgia. The myth of Moscow as the Third Rome frames Russia not as a fallen power, but as a rightful inheritor of global leadership. This narrative helps to explain, at least in part, the invasion of Ukraine, which many Russian elites see not as an act of aggression so much as a reclamation of historic destiny. Or consider China's Century of Humiliation, a national narrative that casts the 19th and early 20th centuries as a time of foreign subjugation and national shame. This narrative has been carefully cultivated by the Chinese Communist Party to justify its current agenda of national rejuvenation. It is not merely propaganda. It is a strategic asset. It binds the people to the state through a shared story of overcoming. It gives Chinese citizens a sense of historical purpose. Even Germany, fractured, defeated, and morally devastated after World War II, rehabilitated its sense of identity through narratives of industrious rebuilding, constitutional dignity, and cultural seriousness. Of course, these narratives are riddled with fiction and omission, but they are effective. And that's the point. In geopolitics, narrative coherence can be more powerful than empirical truth. As historian Yuval Noah Harari notes in his book Sapiens, what sets Homo sapiens apart isn't just our capacity for tool use or abstract thought. It's our ability to cooperate flexibly in large groups through shared fictions. These fictions, origin myths, constitutions, cultural scripts, bind people not just by blood or force, but by belief. And when belief collapses, the consequences are civilizational. Anthropologist Clifford Geertz made a similar point in his work on symbolic systems. Societies are held together not just by material incentives, but by webs of significance they themselves have spun. In that light, the durability of a society's myth may be as important as the durability of its infrastructure. Narratives give meaning to sacrifice. They shape the moral contours of a people's ambition. And when those narratives corrode to become instruments of self-loathing rather than shared purpose, then even the strongest society risks fracture from within. Such is the case in America today. Our national story has shifted from one of providence and progress to one of guilt and grievance. In so-called elite cultural circles, especially in academia, the idea of American exceptionalism has not merely been questioned, it has become outright disdained. Where we once saw the American Revolution as a world-historic step toward liberty, we are now told it was little more than a smokescreen for slavery. Where we once honored the Constitution as a pioneering framework for a free society, we now dissect it as a document of embedded oppression. Of course, history must be revised from time to time, but there's a difference between revision and erasure, between expanding a story and replacing it with one that dissolves national cohesion. The 1619 Project, published by the New York Times in 2019 and now a fixture in many American classrooms, epitomizes this narrative inversion. Its core claim that America's true founding was not 1776, but 1619, the year the first enslaved Africans arrived in Virginia, argues that the country should not be defined by its ideals, but by its betrayals. This story is powerful, not because it's wholly false, but because it's partially true. That's what makes narrative warfare so effective. The most corrosive ideas are rarely outright fabrications. They are distortions. And distortions have consequences. According to recent surveys by Pew and Gallup, a growing number of young Americans say they are not proud to be American. Among college-educated adults under 30, fewer than 1 in 5 express high levels of national pride. This is not a global trend. In China, our most significant geopolitical foe, patriotism is on the rise. In Russia, state-controlled media has revived the idea of Moscow as the Third Rome, the rightful successor to the Roman and Byzantine empires. Even in Western Europe, nations like France and Poland are resurrecting nationalist narratives in response to mass immigration and cultural globalization. America, by contrast, seems increasingly unsure of its identity. And while self-critique can be virtuous, at a certain point it becomes self-negation. This is not a partisan point, it is a historical observation. Great nations that lose the will to narrate their greatness tend not to thrive. This makes it worth asking, what kinds of national stories that once commanded open allegiance across class, region, and political orientation are now not only defunct but utterly taboo among Americans. And what might Americans have lost in excising such stories from the zeitgeist? One provocative example is the idea of manifest destiny, a concept that once served as the narrative engine of American expansion. Whether you admire or detest it, Manifest Destiny was absolutely a unifying story. It told Americans that they were pioneers of liberty, bringers of light to a dark continent. It mobilized not just armies, but settlers, teachers, engineers. It provided coherence to national ambition. That coherence is evident in the private writings of settlers like Narcissa Whitman, who crossed the Rockies in 1836 as one of the first white women to journey into what was then considered the wilderness of the Oregon Territory. In one letter home, she wrote with both awe and religious conviction, quote, "The scenery through which we pass today, though desolate and wild, was grand and even sublime. I can scarcely realize that I am indeed crossing the Rocky Mountains, going with the gospel of peace into the dark places of the earth." End quote. Clearly for her, and for countless others like her in those early frontier days, the journey west wasn't just physical, it was metaphysical, wrapped in a story that gave moral purpose to the hardship. Or consider the 1845 editorial by journalist John L. O'Sullivan in the United States Magazine and Democratic Review, the very piece that coined the term Manifest Destiny. He argued, quote, "The boundless future will be the era of American greatness. In its magnificent domain of space and time, this nation of many nations is destined to manifest the excellence of divine principles." End quote. Here, expansion was portrayed as a kind of populist creed. The power of this narrative was not in how it made elites feel important, but in how it made ordinary citizens feel necessary. Despite all of its retrospectively obvious moral liabilities, the narrative of Manifest Destiny is what filled wagons, dug canals, taught children, laid rails. It's what turned policy into pilgrimage. Contrast that with today, when the dominant cultural narrative tells us not that America is a light to the nations, but a cautionary tale. Instead of manifest destiny, we have inherited manifest guilt. No one with any influence in our society today denies America's sins. The institution of slavery was real, Jim Crow was real, and yes, all of this is still taught in high school. What's striking is not that these sins are remembered, it's that they now appear to define the national story to the exclusion of all else. Few would argue that Athens, Greece should only be remembered as a slaveholding society, even though it was. We remember it as the birthplace of democracy and philosophy. We do not wholly condemn the Enlightenment for its colonial entanglements. We celebrate its intellectual contributions, its cultural flourishing, its scientific legacy. And this brings us to a crucial point. America was not unique in its embrace of slavery. It was unique in how it abolished it. The United States fought the bloodiest war in its history to end slavery. Over 600,000 Americans died. That number is larger than the U.S. death toll in World War I and World War II combined. The American Civil War wasn't just another conflict. It was an existential reckoning that culminated in emancipation. Yet, how many young Americans today know this history in full? How many realize that the United States, unlike all other slaveholding civilizations throughout human history, fought itself to pieces over the principle that all men are created equal? How many understand that the American Civil Rights Movement succeeded in large part because the ideals of the American founding, freedom, equality, the rule of law, were powerful enough to be weaponized against the hypocrisies of the nation that proclaimed them? This is the paradox. America is unique not in its sins, but in its response to those sins. What distinguishes us is not that we had slavery, but that we destroyed it decisively at extraordinary cost. Not that we fell short of our ideals, but that our ideals were strong enough to compel reform. It would be helpful if educators actually educated American students on these facts. It would be helpful if American students knew that slavery has existed in nearly every civilization throughout history. The transatlantic slave trade, which brought roughly 12 million Africans to the Americas over 4 centuries, was only one chapter in a much longer saga of slavery. The Arab slave trade, for instance, began in the 7th century and persisted for over 1,300 years, enslaving Africans and Persians and Slavs and Indians across vast swaths of the Islamic world. Some historians estimate that the Arab slave trade trafficked even more individuals than the transatlantic trade, though record-keeping was far spottier. And unlike the slavery practiced in the Americas, it often involved eunuchs, concubinage, and generational erasure. Manumission was rare, reproduction rarer still. White people were enslaved en masse. Between the 16th and 18th centuries, Barbary pirates from modern-day Morocco, Algeria, Tunisia, and Libya raided the coasts of Europe and captured more than 1 million white Europeans to be sold back in North African slave markets. Christian boys in the Ottoman Empire were forced into slave-like military or bureaucratic service. And serfdom, slavery in all but name, persisted in Russia through the mid-1800s. We could go on. But the relevant point here is that most of these systems were dismantled gradually by decree or economic change, not by bloodshed, civil war, democratic upheaval. America's violent abolition of slavery, for all its delay and contradiction, came at a historically high price, and for many, that's the measure of its moral weight. If we lose this historical perspective, we lose the narrative thread that allowed America to evolve past slavery in the first place. And if we lose that narrative entirely, we will lose the nation. History shows us that nations do not survive long in a vacuum of meaning. When people no longer believe their country is good, they will not fight for it. They will not sacrifice for it. They will not sustain it. The geopolitical consequences of that disillusionment are profound. We saw this unfold with stunning clarity in the final decades of the Soviet Union. By the 1970s and 80s, Soviet citizens were no longer gripped by the ideological fervor that had once galvanized the revolution. Cynicism had replaced conviction. As Alexander Solzhenitsyn lamented in the Gulag Archipelago, quote, "The simple step of a courageous individual is not to take part in the lie," end quote. By the time he published that book in 1973, most people were already withdrawing into quiet non-participation. The grand narrative of socialist utopia had collapsed under the weight of its own contradictions, and without that sustaining story, the empire hollowed out from within. By the time the Berlin Wall fell, there was hardly a soul left who believed in the moral purpose of the regime. There were tanks and warheads, but no will. The machinery of state was not enough. What had sustained the Soviet Union was not just its infrastructure, but its story. So, where does this leave us? Is America really prepared to talk itself into becoming a failed experiment? A nation so disillusioned with its past that it has no future? Perhaps, for a more optimistic ending, we should recall the words of Christopher Hitchens, the British-born intellectual who chose to become an American citizen at age 58. Quote, "In no other country could a self-criticism of this intensity even be possible, and this capacity for self-criticism is the very essence of America's strength." End quote. I hope Christopher Hitchens was right. The story of narrative warfare isn't just academic. It's strategic. Because, in the long run, the nations that shape the future are the ones that believe they belong in it. I'm Brad Harris. So long.